If you've ever looked into publishing, maybe even self-publishing a book using on-demand printing service, you have to pick your binding. And the most common book binding that is selected is called perfect binding. So you might see that as an option and think, well, yes, perfect binding, of course. I want my binding to be perfect. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what kinds of bindings there are, what are their benefits, what are they called, and I'm only going to cover the four most common ones.
For more than 30 years, we've published unique stories, insights, and case studies, from neural machine translation to racial bias and localization.
Visit multilingual.com/subscribe and start reading today. So we'll start with perfect binding. And perfect binding is a type of binding that uses glue and is used for soft cover books. The pages are collected in what is called a signature. Signatures always need to be a multiple of 4. Usually they're 16 for books, sometimes even 32. So when you look closely at the binding, you can see that the pages are put together in sections. These sections are called the signature. And that is why you are limited also in the page count, the page count that you can select. You can't just say, okay, I want a book to be, it's 50 pages, so I want it to be 50 pages. It's 51 pages, I want it to be 51 pages, unless you add some blank pages. This is also why sometimes when you get a book that is self-published or a book that is published not super professionally, you might see some blank pages at the end. And I mean more than 3. So that's perfect binding. Now, I publish a magazine and it also uses perfect binding. You'll see that a lot of magazines use perfect binding. It's cheap, it's efficient, but again, you have to be very careful about your page count. So this is our magazine. You have a thicker cover, and then the pages inside are of a magazine quality, which is that thin, crisp feeling. And perfect binding, you can see the spine, you can see the glue, you can see the signatures. Our magazine uses signatures of 16, which means that we publish multiples of 16, but this is important. Multiples of 16 of the inside pages. Your cover is going to be glued to that. You always have to count a multiple of 16 plus 4. We are not the only magazine who uses perfect binding. You can see Wired uses perfect binding. Perfect binding also gives you a spine. So the spine is this part. It's always delivered as a separate item in your layout. So your spine will hold your title usually, maybe the date of publication. Vanity Fair also uses it. Spine, C number, May 2020. Fast Company also has a spine. What's nice about spine magazines, here's another one. Atlantic also uses perfect binding with a spine. What's nice about having a spine on your publication is you can put them together like so, and it's easy to reference. Time Magazine uses a different kind of binding. We're going to get to that soon. First, let's go back to the books. So you might think, okay, perfect binding, I get it. What is that other kind of binding? That other kind of binding that I know from my old books that I had, this hardcover, old-fashioned binding that works on a network of canvas. It's called case binding. Case binding also works with signatures. They can be larger, and case binding is the most common way to bind hardcover books. They are glued together still in a text block. The text block is then attached to the cover or case, which is why it's called case binding, and it can be made of paper, cloth, vinyl, or leather. This is also known as cloth binding or edition binding. Then there's the more elusive spiral binding. Spiral binding is popular because it's the most economical form of mechanical binding when using plastic or metal. It's commonly used for atlases. This is so that you can open things and really open it. You can leave it open on a table. It won't flip its own pages. It can sit really flat. There's no need for signatures or anything like that, so you can really, really select your number of pages. You're not limited or bound by a certain number of pages. Now, where confusion arose for me is one time I had to do a publishing job for another company, and I said, do you want perfect binding or saddle stitching? And this is where the confusion arose. Saddle stitching, to me, as a Dutch person, sounds like it would be something stitched. So you think of this kind of binding, of this case binding, right? But saddle stitching is not actually stitched. The stitching refers to staples. And Time Magazine uses saddle stitching. They use staples. The signature is literally 4 pages because each page has 4 sides, and it can just get stitched together. So not really actually sewing, but stapling. It's cheap, it's efficient, you have a lot of freedom with your page count. You can do this in a garage, without special materials. You just need a really big stapler. There's no spine, so you have to be really careful with changing your front and your back cover image and make sure that they blend right on the spine. Right on the stitches. So there you have it. Those are the 4 most common forms of binding you'll find nowadays. If you have any additional questions about publishing, you want to know more about signatures, you want to know more about layout, pagination, should you start counting your cover, which is what we do. This is page 1. This is page 2, even though they're not actually part of the content. So let me know if you want to understand more about printing, about publishing. Leave a comment and I'll try to address it.